well, thank you. And you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. Yeah, I'm good. So,
Good evening. Hi.
Yes, hi there, David. I am in the privileged position that I know all of you, and so you know that my name, and also I think David, you've been, Sandra especially has been on these for several years. David, you have as well, for at least 2 or 3 of them, I believe.
I think 3 now. Yeah.
And Sandra's been with me for 4, and Alan has been with me throughout the whole year practically. So yeah, I feel that I know you
dozens and dozens.
Dozens of times, yes. And Susan, I know from a long time ago when I lived in London, so over 10 years. So welcome to the 5th annual Creativity and Culture Conference. For the sake of everyone else, could you please introduce yourself? Let me start with you, Alan, if you could briefly introduce yourself to the rest of the panel.
Okay, I prefer to be called Alan, but the name they gave me was Robert Alan Black. I use that for professional and aesthetic reasons, but for personal reasons, I use Alan. Creative thinking has been a focus of mine for over 40 years consciously, since I first read 2 articles by a man named Paul Torrance, that all human beings are born with capacities to think creatively. And the second one is that we can increase, expand, and deepen our abilities as long as we are alive.
Great. Thank you very much, Alan. David?
Hi, my name is David Chislett. I call myself a creativity activator, and I'm definitely with Robert Allen and Mr. Torrance. I believe everybody is inherently creative, that it's a human capacity. And so my mission professionally is to help as many people activate their inherent creativity and understand it better so they can reap the benefits of it.
Okay, brilliant. And Sandra?
My name is Sandra Kavanaugh. I am a creativity specialist, and I spent 35 years in the theater teaching and directing and acting, and came to the understanding that Shakespeare's statement that all the world's a stage is not just a pretty piece of poetry, but a metaphorical, metaphysical guide to life. So I help people to discover and express their unique creative genius by using techniques that I've developed over 35 years in teaching acting. I believe, like you, that everyone is a brilliant, unique, creative genius. And I mean everybody. And we don't have a shortage of brilliance in this world. We just have a reluctance to offer it and a resistance to accepting it. So that's what I help people do.
Thank you, Sandra. And Susan? Susan?
Because there are now 2 Susans.
Yeah, I know there's 2. And Susan Sharp, I believe that your microphone is not switched on yet. So while Susan Popula is introducing herself, if you could please sort out your microphone, Susan Sharp, please. Go ahead, Susan Popula.
I'm Susan Popula. Almost following on from Sandra, I'll say I'm a human value optimization specialist, and that is that I believe everyone has value to offer in some way, shape, or form. And the key is how to realize, optimize, make the most of that in its creative forms and in all other forms. And all the work that I do is focused around realizing, optimizing the value in this wide, diverse, as I call it, mosaic world that we live in.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Susan. Orlando, if you could just briefly introduce yourself, Orlando.
Yes, good evening. I can't see you.
We can see you, Orlando.
You can see me.
Yeah, we can see you, so that's fine. Yeah, maybe you'll be able to see us as well.
Okay.
Fine,
That may be a benefit, Orlando.
So Orlando, if you could, I mean, I know you very well, but if you could introduce yourself briefly to the group, just say maybe like where you live and what you do. Okay. All right, maybe we'll hear from Orlando in a little while. So the way this discussion will work is that my role is simply to make sure that the discussion keeps moving and that everyone gets a chance to speak, and that everyone feels that they're able to comment when appropriate to what everyone else has said. So to make my job easier as the chair, could you please use the raise hand function, which is if you click on the reactions button at the bottom of your menu, there is the emoticon for raise hand. Can everyone see it? Okay, brilliant. Excellent. So that will make it so much easier for me to know who is ready to speak rather than simply calling on someone when they they feel that they haven't actually got anything to comment on at that point in time. So I've had a conversation with all of you about the creative power of stories, and we've had some really in-depth, inspiring conversations in my view. And the core essence of these conversations was that, yes, indeed, stories are very powerful. Stories can be very influential. And the primary question around this is, well, how is it that stories are so powerful? How do they influence us? Shall I start with you, Alan?
That's fine with me.
Go ahead, Alan.
I want to start with about 45 years ago, I got interested consciously in stories. Though my father told me stories a few times as I grew up, and I did read some, and I have quite a collection behind me of books about stories and storytelling. But the one that struck me, it's a Yiddish story about two men, could be two women, or it could be one of each, walk into the center of the village, and one is called story, and one is called facts or data. And they greet, and story usually is bubbly and laughing and smiling most of the time, very energetic. But he sees his friend Facts looking bored, looking depressed, looking down. And he asks, he says, I tell the people the Russians are coming, the crops are dying, the cattle are dying, and they won't take me serious. They won't listen to me. And Story stopped for a moment, paused, and then said, perhaps if you gave a little more adjective, you made it more interesting to listen to, and not just give us numbers and always the negative, people might listen to you. In other words, don't just say it, tell a story. And I've found that throughout, ever since I first heard that story, and there is a version of that story in almost every culture I've had any relation with, that it's a common humankind knowledge that we need story. But at the same time, I see there are people who are highly logical, highly scientific, the generic term of scientific, who don't like stories. They don't mind a few adjectives here and there, but they want to know the facts. Then there are the people who only want to hear the stories that are accepted as the right story, written in some famous book. The third are people who love story. They live story. They are story. And then there's the fourth, who can go either way, but their stories are always very dramatic. Our lives are full of stories, but we don't always pass them on. And the sadness in my life, I'm very involved with a memoir writing group now, is that I know very few stories from my parents, because I was too dumb before I got to know about stories and the importance of it, and they had passed away. Stories are important and they promote creative thinking.
Yeah. Sandra, I'm sure you agree with a lot of what Alan said. Go ahead, Sandra, you have your hand raised.
I do agree with probably all of what Alan said, but I think that I would add to that and say that not only are we all, telling stories and things are more, animated in the public dialogue when they contain a story, but we're all, the first thing Alan said was something about being consciously aware of story for a certain amount of years. And I think that that's the distinction. We are all constantly co-creating whatever our world is that we're living in. We are all constantly contributing our point of view and what we're contributing to the writing of this global story and our own story. And it's just a question of whether or not we're conscious of the fact that every thought, word, and deed that we express is writing a story. You know, when an author sits down to write a story, they choose a point of view. And we have every ability, we have 100% ability in all aspects of our life to choose what we're contributing to the story and how we're viewing the stories of others. You know, if I see somebody with a child, say, with some kind of neurological processing problem, and they are acting out and they're flailing and they're throwing a fit. Now, lots of people might see that as a child that is a problem. Someone who is looking at it from the point of view of the child might be looking at what is causing that in the child. And the child has a completely different story going on, and the parents have a completely different story going on, whether or not they are affected by the attitudes of others, et cetera, or whether they're focused on their child. It influences every relationship that we have, the way we view story and the way we view the point of view that we are taking on the story, and our contribution, our responsibility for our contribution to that story, both the global story and our own.
Yeah, and what you say reminds me, you know, when you talk about stories from different points of view, the parent story and the child story, and nowadays there are so many films telling the story from the horse's point of view, for example, or from the, you know, the cat's point of view. And when we learn to see things from different perspectives like that, you know, the insect, the tiny little insects, how do they, a ladybird's life, you know, the ladybug's life, that's a story as well, isn't it? Like, do we see the story from a blade of grass, from the point of view of a blade of grass? Do we see the story of what's happening in the earth from, you know, from the blade of grass that's constantly being, or the dandelion? Do we see the story from the point of view of the dandelion that's constantly being sprayed by pesticide, etc.? David, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. I think, you know, for me, what's, you know, critical to story is that it's kind of a function of our consciousness. Because apart from being conscious beings, I mean, all animals are conscious beings as well. You know, we're self-conscious beings, and that self-awareness is itself a story. It's a reflection on the self, and it's impossible to reflect on something without casting it in some kind of story. So, you know, it doesn't matter what perspective a story is being told to us by someone else. Our experience of that story will always be from our perspective, and it'll become part of our consciousness and therefore part of our self-reflection and inevitably part of our story. And as a result, I don't think it's any coincidence that it's been proven time and again under all sorts of experiments and psychological studies that people learn so much better when the material is presented in a story, because we narrate our lives from our self-conscious perspective. And so it is so much easier to retain a set of facts or new information when it falls into a similar pattern to how we process our day-to-day experience anyway.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, David, because that's one of being an educator, there's always a struggle in terms of time. I agree with you that stories can help us to remember so much more information than facts presented in isolation. But when we're teaching mathematics, for example, formulas, accountancy, biology, you know, I know Sandra, when I had a conversation with her, she said everything is a story. Even, you know, scientific facts form parts of stories, but there are things that have to be learned and memorized, and it's very difficult to form a story around these intangible things, concepts. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, if I could just reply to that. Sorry, I don't want to hog the time here, but really, I mean, because all that's about is standardized testing, which is part of what's killing creativity in our kids. which is part of what's leading us to doomsday at a rapid rate of knots, because we can't think outside the box and we keep on doing the same stupid stuff over and over and over. So I dispute that strongly. I think that may in fact be part of the problem, that we insist that there are certain things that can't be told in story. And, you know, because that's just a story, you know, and who's telling that and why? And I think that's what we need to be interrogating.
Yeah, it's you know, these paradigms, like when you have scientists and artists in the room, and by artist I'm talking about everyone who's a social scientist as opposed to a natural scientist. There are always these arguments about what's the best way to learn. You know, it's to be debated. Susan, go ahead. I see you have your hand up. Susan.
Yeah, I was just going to say, almost following on from there, I would agree. There's something about story in everything. And presenting stories, you present a story differently based on the audience. So if you take Alan's point of what people like to hear, so you can have a story that has a lot of detail to it, but you can have a story that has facts and information embedded within it, but there is that importance of story. And I would say one of the key things that I found is stories create connections. They bring things to life and they bring connections. Some of the work that I do is with young people, and young people who have been in the care system here in Britain. And one of the things, they're not people, they're people that haven't always been listened to, haven't always been heard. So when I bring people in as guests to speak to them in the sessions that I run with them, I always want those people to start off with stories. Your knowledge is secondary to who you are. If through the story of where you've come from and your journey, you can create a connection, then the information and the knowledge that you have is more valid. At the same time, if people understand my story, how I've come here, how I've come to be as I am, they're more likely to engage and connect with me and accept me as I am and for who I am and for what I have to offer with all my flaws, the few little flaws that I have, than if they didn't have an understanding of the context of who I am, which comes about in stories. And then I just conclude on that thing about connection and how it works for me. I have a number of nephews and nieces. When one of my older nieces was young, she had a habit of standing up in the car, and she would be in the middle, and if the car stopped suddenly, she would be pushed to the front. And so I told her a story. If you do that, you know what could happen. You could go straight through the windscreen and you'd become a squashed tomato. And I had forgotten about that until many years later. I had another niece, her little sister, who I hadn't seen for years. And I was in the car with them and I heard her telling the story of the squashed tomato. And I saw how quickly her little sister sat down just because she just said squashed tomato. She didn't even have to tell the whole story. So I think there's the power of connection and understanding with stories as well. No matter what we're talking about, it makes things more memorable as well.
Okay, thank you, Susan. Sandra, go ahead.
Yeah, I just piggybacking on what Susan just said, I think that that understanding of someone's story and listening to their story in whatever form it comes forward, that's where we get compassion. You know, we a lot of times those kids, I work with kids with developmental disabilities a lot too, and I'm always screaming, everyone is brilliant. And I once had a teacher of a special ed class that I had worked with and taken to a whole level that nobody believed they could go to. And she, in the middle of the class one day, she yelled, "Do you know what I love about Ms. Kavanaugh?" And the kids all stopped and she goes, "She teaches like she doesn't know there's anything you can't do. And so there isn't." And so my story around them is that it's just the stories that we tell about the facts, as David said, that limit our perspective on what we think their story is. We think that these kids have to learn math in a certain way, or that they even have to learn math to have a successful creative life. Maybe they can't. Who cares? I mean, if they are living with a particular disability that makes math a thing that's not their thing, then rather than sort of put them into a box that labels them a certain kind of non-creative, non-smart, non-talented, non-whatever, that they can't be a genius, to tell the story around them that we are unearthing their genius, that we're unearthing their brilliance, that we're unearthing their creativity, because they've got it. I mean, I can't imagine that any of us were born, any of us, meaning anybody on the planet, was born without the ability to create. They are creating a story, and we just have to be willing to listen to it, I think, and not impose our stories on them, like the education system imposes a lot of stories, I think.
I agree with you, Sandra. I totally agree with you. And there's so much I want to say, but Susan Sharp hasn't had a chance to speak yet. So, so welcome to the course, Susan. I see you have your hand raised. So just briefly introduce yourself, because you didn't get a chance to do that earlier, and let us know your comments on that.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I've had major technical difficulties, of course, on the one time I need to be somewhere this weekend. So so I'm Susan Sharp, and my primary goal in life is to use creativity to help others over ruts or bumps in life. And so to that end, I write and speak, and I'm an abstract artist. And I haven't quite heard the questions posed, but I believe strongly in the power of our own stories in terms of what stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And so that self story, I think, can be extremely powerful. And so to Sandra's point, yes, I think we all have a genius within us. And I think it's imperative that we keep telling ourselves that, because sometimes life gets really hard, and the message that we speak about ourselves, about our gifts, are extremely important to remember and to keep recalling when times get tough. It's a message I've always tried to teach others, to what you say about yourself, what you're thinking about yourself, is probably the most powerful story you'll ever tell.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Susan. And Susan, I know you're an artist, and this question that I wanted to, when Sandra was talking earlier, what I wanted to raise is this whole question of value. Now, it's cultural. In some cultures, creativity is very highly valued, and there are management reports saying, oh, organizations say that creativity is the third top skill that they're looking for, but I don't actually see that in practice. Although we see these reports coming out, in practice, we know that science subjects are valued more. People will get paid more if they become a scientist compared with if they become an artist. And you've been in academia for a long time, so if I could just have your comments on that in terms of valuing, like in terms of when we're encouraging our children to look for careers. I know from my own culture, I know that they will be pushed more towards the science subjects compared with the creativity subjects, because they're likely to have a securer future in that and be better paid.
Yeah, the subject of value is always a tricky thing. How does an artist price their work? And at the end of the day, I suppose the work is treasured by us, but it's worth what someone will pay for it. And so it's hard to value. It's also hard to sell when art is not necessarily based on data. And for whatever reason, the scientific community loves numbers. It quantifies it. So I wish that maybe in the artistic world we could somehow quantify it in a way that would translate to to others more broadly. We certainly have our own internal quantification systems, time, materials, quality of the materials, our training, how long did it take us to learn and perfect this technique? So those are our internal parameters, but nobody cares about those things when they want to buy a piece of art. So it's a hard thing to quantify. And I don't know as though I have a great answer, but I do wonder if it lies in the ability to translate it somehow numerically, or at least in a system that relates to numbers in some way.
Okay, Susan, you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
I was just thinking out loud. I was just going to reflect that. Should I bring that back to that part of the earlier conversation when we spoke about the stories that we tell ourselves? So if we're able to think of the value, if we're able to see what we do as valuable, and we understand that it has an impact, how it impacts on people's well-being, how this is where innovation comes from, and all those other things that are aligned to creativity. If we're able to start to tell ourselves the story of the value that we add, and we're also then able to go on to tell other people that what we do is of value, it's just as important and as significant as the work of a scientist, then maybe other people will begin to see it as valuable as well.
Okay, Susan, thank you. Sandra?
Yeah, I think it has to do, just as Susan said, with how are we defining value, and how are we even defining creativity? We are all creating all the time. Everything we do is creating something. Everything we think is creating something. If only the story that we're telling, we're creating that. And if we're talking about monetary value, that's a story. And that has just set up, as Susan Sharp said, parameters, that give us the boxes to tick off to tell whether or not something is of value. But that's really only talking about monetary value, and not considering, as the other Susan said,
Susan P.
There we go. Not considering, as Susan P said, that it's about, the value to yourself, because in my belief, we all came here to find and then express our bliss. What is our unique, bliss area, as Joseph Campbell would say. And when we live our bliss, we are contributing value. It necessarily, at least that's what I believe. And so I think the challenge is with the stories around value and the stories around the definition of even creativity.
Thank you, Sandra. David, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I think as soon as the conversation gets to value, it's a real slippery fish, because I also agree with Susan P. I mean, you've got to start off with valuing stuff yourself. But the problem is that bridging that out into the world is that it's not your decision after that. And it doesn't actually matter how much you see the value, or you see the potential value for people, if the market per se, the people outside there that you are trying to engage with, see no value. Well, that's the end of that. It reminds me, there's a book which I'm a big fan of, which came out a couple of years ago, called The Creative Curve, by a young man called Alan Gannett. And his whole idea of the creative curve is that new creative ideas have value when they exist far enough away from what we already have to stick out, to be noticeable, to be different, but not so far that they are intimidating and scary and nobody dares to go anywhere near them. And so value is quite often actually almost like a positional relationship of how new and different is this creative thing compared to what already exists. If it's too new and too different, like Van Gogh was in the beginning of his career, people aren't interested. But as the work, or as the culture sort of catches up, suddenly that distance from the curve of what's accepted as normal to what is new gets closer, and then suddenly value becomes obvious to more people. And I mean, I think anyone who can figure out the equation of where that sweet spot lies, is I want to know, because I don't think anybody has that up until now.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Thank you, David. Susan, you have your hand raised. Susan Sharp.
I forgot why I raised my hand. I got lost in the conversation, which is great. Um, I guess I would just add that I totally agree with David, and the value proposition is one that I think we tend not to talk about very much. I'm same in the speaker's world. Nobody wants to share what their speaker fee is, and I think that's always such a funny thing. But to Susan's point, yes, intrinsic value has to start with us. And I think that's hard as an artist, because sometimes I want to keep everything I create. And then you have a house full or a studio full, and that's hard too. But so what's I don't know the magic formula for value and intrinsic value that we place on our art. But I do think when you price the art in what I would call the serious collector range, then you do eliminate a part of the market. Why? You eliminate a lot of the market. And is that good or bad? That's always the key thing. And I've played with pricing, I've played with valuation for my speaking, and it's sometimes it just comes down to the timing of it all. So I stress less about it now than I used to, as long as I keep making money.
Yeah, in some cultures, they have storytellers of it. Storytellers are a very strong feature of the culture, and they don't set fees. They are paid through donations, and I suppose that donations is an excellent example of how it's society that places value on what your storytelling is worth, basically.
Yes.
Alan, you had your hand raised.
A couple of times. Next time I need to sit in a room where I have a white background so my hand shows up more. A couple little short points. I was going to try to jump in before David did with the Van Gogh example, or Van Gogh. I still have difficulty pronouncing his name properly in Dutch. But the idea of being ahead of your time, behind your time, so unique, so strange, destroys a lot of artists. They give up. When I taught in art schools many years ago, I could see that. To go to Susan's point, I've been a speaker for over 40 years, and clients will tell you what you will be paid, unless you have sold a book that sells for millions. I won't use the president's name, but we've had presidents paid over $1 million to speak, and he didn't say anything that was worth listening to. But when clients would say, well, you charge $4,000, by the way, I never have, I've charged $3,000, but anyway, well, I'm paying you $4,000 for 30 minutes? No, you are paying me $4,000 because of the life I've lived and the study I have done that makes it possible for me to share in 30 minutes, relevant to you. Two other real quick things. I always think of the drawing. I saw it in elementary school as a mimeograph. Now, most of you are too young to remember what mimeograph was, but what it was a man sitting at a desk, bald, unfortunately, the classic stereotype, and here's a line of animals, and he was going to teach them how to climb a tree. And the animals for A to Z. Not many hippos, no matter how well they're trained, are going to climb trees easily. But then the monkey, of course, is the champion. Going to Sandra's point, we have, whether you call it genius or skill or capability, people have capabilities to do things that are not, quote, normal. You have to find, like the example, and then I'll stop because I can go on for days, unfortunately, and maybe the rest of you, is you remember the name Fosbury Flop. This was a high jumper in the Olympics who broke the record by going over backwards. Then it became the way of jumping. Well, as it turns out, in Africa, some of the tribes jump for many reasons, but they do it by stepping on a stump or a dead anthill. Well, they had problems with the Olympics because they wouldn't let them build a dead anthill or use a thing in order to jump. And I don't recall how they solved that one, but at least that, yes, these children, because I started with what are called academically gifted children. I won't go into a long story on it, but they fascinated me. They all had phenomenal focuses on something. From the migrant worker who knew everything about horses, you can imagine, but he barely spoke English. Another boy was a kindergartner who could give me a lecture about geology that a scientist would be challenged by. In fact, and I'll end with this, his mother commented, I heard last night at dinner, you asked John to tell you about his rocks. No one ever asked John to talk about his rocks. It was fascinating. So I applaud each one of you in supporting each one of your comments, and I'll take my hand down.
Thank you. Thanks, Alan. Susan Sharp, you have your hand raised.
Oh, I can't turn the hand raise off.
Ah, okay, so yeah, you just click back on it, you know, in the same way that you raised your hand. And
Yeah, I tried that. It's not a technologically great day for me.
oh, okay, not to worry. And Orlando, I see that you haven't raised your hand at all. So I'm wondering if you know how to raise your hand, Orlando. So let me just call on you. Orlando, in the conversation that I've had with Orlando separately, we talked a lot about stories that reflect our culture. And we talked about the fact that some stories are listened to and others are not heard as much. Orlando, do you remember anything more about the essence of that
Yes, thank you. I'm finding the conversation really interesting. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
We can hear you.
yeah. The conversation so far is quite interesting in the sense that it sounds rather academic perspective, really, about storytelling. What is interesting to me is about the psychological intake of storytelling, where you don't have a once upon a time a situation. It's a cultural intake of activities and things that you see around you and you hear. That is a form of storytelling. My experience growing up in a colonial situation where my beginnings was very humble, very, very humble indeed. And my parents, their existence was about putting food on the table. But they talked about things in their past and things that they hope to do. And you would listen to their conversations. Because incidentally, in colonial Jamaica, rearing of children is very Victorian, and children must be seen and not be heard. So you wasn't involved in the conversation, but you would be consuming what was happening and what was being said psychologically. And I can remember hearing about ambition, because if you can imagine in that situation, the only way, as they say, is up. So ambition was a big word, a very important factor in my life growing up as a child. And then when I came to this country, reluctantly, I must add, my parents had gone ahead and they set up home and everything, and I was being brought up in back home with relatives, and that was having a whale of a time. Too much so, some would say. So when I was summoned to come to the UK, and I started going to school, I was absolutely taken aback when I understood that my peers didn't have any ambition. You know, I would ask people, well, what do you want to, oh, I've got an ambition to do anything. I just go through school and I'll get a job, and that's it. I was totally blown away when I heard that. So in my situation, my colonial situation, I consumed the idea that ambition was very important, and you got to work hard to make something of yourself. And that was a cultural thing, certainly in my family, and most of the people I grew up with, they have that drive, that idea that they had to move from where they were in life, in society, to another level.
Yeah.
And they got that
Yes.
from storytelling.
Yeah, I was just going to comment there that in terms of cultural differences, what I notice is that there are cultures in which relationships are much stronger than other cultures, and there was a turning point in my life when my ambition became different to my parents' ambition. My parents' ambition was about having a strong family, and my ambition was not so much about having a strong family, but about having professional goals. And what do the rest of you think about that in terms of stories and how they influence what is, you know, we've been talking about value, the value of stories, but what about the value of, like, what makes a good life? Is a good life about relationships, or is a good life about achievements that are professional achievements, scientific achievements, technological achievements? What is it? You know, what are the stories that we're telling ourselves? What is the substance of these stories? Because these stories have transformed, you know, and we can talk about Afghanistan. The stories have, there are polarized stories of, like, what makes a good life there. There are those who think a good life is about building family. There are those who think that good life is about technological advancements and progress, material progress. What are your comments, Alan?
Okay, I found a way to let you see my hand.
Yeah, but I couldn't see it because it's not raised, Alan. I called you anyway. No, I can't see that because
Really?
no, no, because I've got speaker view. So anyway,
okay, there we go. All right, you weren't on gallery. Now I understand that. I'll take that off. Real quick on that, as I said, I work on my memoir, Stories from My Life. It's been a hobby of mine for self-awareness, self-analysis. I have boxes full of journals from the 70s and the 80s and 90s when I just got so busy I didn't take time to do it. But as I was hearing Orlando talk about the key to ambition, I'm thinking about writing a story or a chapter about what word guided your family. In my case, I know a little bit about my parents, but we never talked about it. Was my mother left Scotland after the World War I, and what was a depression for them after the war, to come to the United States as I said, an indentured servant. Now, she wasn't a slave, but her life was pretty well controlled by that family that paid for her tickets across the ocean. And there are many steps between there and when she ended up in Detroit, and then coincidentally meeting my father at a party one Sunday. My father's story, he came over the first time. His father had already worked on ships and was gone most of the time. So the family was left to survive. All four of the children worked when they were old enough. My father worked in coal mines as a cart boy. At the age of 14, he was the oldest. They came over to the United States. In Ellis Island, some great guard decided to put my grandmother and youngest uncle into quarantine, suspicious of she had some illness. Well, she did. They were sent back. She died within 2 weeks. I didn't learn until the night after we left the funeral home for my mother. My father finally stopped talking long enough to cry. I had only seen him with tears in his eyes once before when his oldest grandson died of leukemia. But the story he told was as they, four of them, or three actually, the baby wouldn't have been there, stood around their mother's bed. He prayed that the family would never be split up. They were split up within a day or two. It was the only way they could survive in that period of time. Not the Great Depression, but the Depression of England and Scotland because of World War I. But he never stopped learning. His ambition was to find something of value that he could have pride in. Everything he did, he had pride in. And he eventually became a chief gear engineer at a major corporation in the United States. Not bad for a cart boy at the age of 12. That story, though never actually told on the couch or on the deck or on the rocking chair on the porch, was a story I grew up with. I became obsessed with doing things of value, but then along came this thing called passion. If what you're doing isn't something you love to do, why are you doing it? And if you love what you do, it's no longer work. I changed the word work to the word play. I found ways until recent years to get people to actually pay me to play. If you have any ideas of how I might do that in 2022, I'm open to suggestions. But one word, and that's how I'll wrap up, because I've gone quite a ways. Orlando, that was phenomenal. You know, are we a family? We were not. Were we a dysfunctional family? No. My parents provided a safe, comfortable, reliable home, and the three of us could do what we chose to do. One became an engineer, one eventually became a police officer, eventually the head of the equivalent of the FEMA program for his county. And I've been 7 things: architect, graphic designer, blah, blah, blah. Ambition, doing what we felt we got respect for doing that helped other people.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan. Susan Popula, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I'm going to sort of connect some of the things that I'm hearing. And I think people talk a lot about nature and nurture. And I'll say we have our basic nature within which are aligned to our passions, the things deep within us that are important to us. Sometimes those things may lay dormant because we're living in an environment with our immediate family, and that's our first influence that impacts on us, that exposes us to ideas. Orlando spoke about the stories that he heard that made him ambitious for something, and other people around. So family will, should I say, tell a story that will nurture us. We'll go to school, that will nurture us. The environments we live in, the local environment, national, global environments, will hear different stories that will nurture us, that will have an impact on us. hopefully somewhere along the line, we will hear stories that will ignite the passions, the deep rooted things that we are really about, that will take us along those paths such that we get to the stage that we're no longer just working, we're doing things that we enjoy. And so the stories that we hear, so that's a way of answering that question, Jesper, in terms of, I think they're different. There's who we are at heart, and there are the influences along the way that guide us, the stories that we hear that take us to a place where hopefully sooner rather than later, we can find ourselves doing the things that we're really passionate about, and not just the things that we're doing because our family said it's important to be a doctor or a lawyer, but we want to be an artist or a writer because those are things that excite us and make us happy.
Well, a lot of the stories that I heard when I was a youngster were about happy families, you know, how to create happy families. And then the stories that I've read, the stories that I've witnessed through my decades of being a professional of creatives are that they are not necessarily part of happy families. They are the ones who have left the happy family because it was too comfortable, and they were willing to suffer and tread their own path rather than conform to the well-trodden path that was comfortable and happy, perhaps. But they sought something which was going to be more of a challenge. And you know, what do the rest of you think about that? The stories of creative people, do we have to, you know, do we kind of lose something? Have we lost the happiness for the sake of creativity in some ways? David?
Yeah, I don't buy into the myth of the tortured artist vibe. I think it's one of those convenient sort of mystic things that are thrown out by highly successful creatives in order to keep the rest of the pack at bay. You know, a bit like lawyers and doctors speaking in Latin. It's just complete smoke and mirrors. I don't buy that at all. But you must have seen the meme on Facebook. You know, here's your comfort zone. Here's where the magic happens. And so on a certain level, you've got to step out. You've got, you know, to remain creative and to be consistently creative, you've got to leave your comfort zone. You've got to leave what you know behind. You've got to take risks. You've got to learn. You've got to release your judgment about what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad, and you've got to step into the ambiguity and the complexity so that you can find the novelty which will allow you to continue to create. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to leave your happy family, but it may well be that you're the troublesome uncle at the head of the table.
Okay, Susan Sharp, your hand is up, and I don't know if it's a legacy hand or you've just raised it. Go ahead.
No, I can't turn it off.
Oh,
So,
okay.
I like what David said. The idea of stepping out of your comfort zone is really important, and I know that my upbringing was quite blue collar and rural, and I knew that I didn't want to be in that forever. And so I'm the first person in my entire family to have a college degree, let alone an advanced degree, as far back as I can trace to the 1600s. So having said that, I feel like I broke something in my cycle of my family and being content. I wasn't content with that narrative for me. And in so doing, I tell a different story. And my family heritage is still with me, but it doesn't necessarily end there. I've started something new in my family story.
Mm-hmm. Right. Excellent. Thank you, Susan. Sandra, do you have any final comments? Because we're coming up to the hour, so I'll just ask everyone just to chip in with any final comments that they have about the discussion so far.
Well, I would just share that I agree with everything that David said, and about about sort of buying into the myth of the tortured artist is kind of, it's one of those sort of cultural stories that we all start getting fed from birth. And I think probably every person here, and probably every person that's ever going to listen to the Creativity and Culture Conference is someone who has, to some degree, stepped out or stepped into the calling that they can feel toward what is their unique thing to offer. And I think that when we stay in that comfort zone, we are not listening to the voice inside that's saying, you know, gosh, I want this, but, you know, money doesn't grow on trees, or, you know, creative people never make money, or whatever, whatever, whatever. I did the same thing. I was the first one in my family with an advanced degree. I'm still the only one in my nuclear family that I am a child of, and all the cousins and all the sides, historically, I'm it. But I have also changed careers many times, and I've raised my daughters so that they are very fluid with having multiple careers. They're very at home with that. And so I again, like David said, I don't believe that you have to be a tortured artist. I don't believe you have to choose family or creativity or your art or whatever. You can have it all if that's the story that you decide to envelop and live, I think.
Okay, great. Anyone else with a final point?
Oh, you can't see me.
Yeah, go ahead, Alan.
I will verbally put my hand up. Okay. All right. Going along with David, because I think of people like, they talk about Van Gogh only sold one painting. And a lot of art historians argue about whether that's true or not. Did he really sell it? Did he really buy it back? And so forth. But he went from one passion to another because he didn't know where he was going. But it turned out to be painting. It turned out to be capturing real life, not kings and queens and prime ministers. It was the local postal man. Walt Disney came from a family that was very dysfunctional. Fortunately, he had the talent. Couldn't draw with a darn, actually, if you look at the history of his life, but he could create ideas and concepts. He was a phenomenal salesman, but he had one brother, an older brother, who believed in him, who made it possible for Disneyland and Disney World and all the rest to happen. And that was Roy, because Roy believed in him. He was his champion. And just briefly, in my case, whether I was a troublesome kid in the classroom or not, all I know is I spent an awful lot of time in our library in my elementary school, except for my art class. It's the only class I was actually there most of the time. And usually I was out in the hallway working on artwork to put on the walls. But I sat in the corner. I could almost draw a picture in a floor plan of our library from 60, actually 70 years ago, right by the biographies and autobiographies. I absorbed them. I have hundreds in my own home of I read. And people, they tell the story, but they tell it out of context. They don't tell what Tom Edison's life really was, or the fact that it was the 200 or 300 people who worked with him who created most of those 2,000 inventions, not him. That's another issue. But I totally support what we've been sharing over the last hour. In my case, it was you go to school. That's all I heard. But I hated high school because I didn't get to go to the high school I wanted to. But sometime at the end of my first degree, I became obsessed. And I worked in college degrees in 4 different universities for over 23 years, completing 5. No one else competed any more than a bachelor's degree, like Sandra was talking about. But my parents were always proud of when I graduated. They only saw 2 graduations before they died. but I can bring out those photos now that I know how to use my scanning machines for black and white photos and see the joy in my father's face that his son had earned a master's degree. Because my father, when he worked on one at night while working 6 or 7 days a week, was told by his major professor, and this is the story I'm ending with, this is what you're going to write on. You didn't tell my father how to think or what he did. He did it if it had to be done, but he always did it his way.
That's very creative. Yeah, thank you. And okay, so it is just on the hour now, but just a final point, Orlando, just very quickly before we go. And I know Susan Popula, you had your hand raised as well. So like maybe a final point from you as well, Orlando.
Yes. Will you say that again?
Yeah, we're just going to end the conversation now, Orlando. So do you just have anything else to add before we end it?
Oh, yes. Oh, certainly. Thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. In my musings, you know, I often think about great men and how they were able to convert something out of their culture. And one of those men for me was a guy called Aaron Bevan. And he went in the pits to work in the pits at 10 years old. And it was from there, working on the coal face, that he started to figure out that something had to be done for the working man. And the rest is really history. It's culture, working in the coal mine. As a 10-year-old boy, and Aaron Bevan decided that he's going to do something to change the situation.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you, Orlando. Susan Popula, I know you had your hand raised. Do you want to just a quick comment?
It was just a concluding comment, and it was really to commend people, to say, continue to tell the stories of who you are and who you want to be, and listen to the stories of other people far and wide. And I believe that in doing so, we can all find connections and the courage to fully realize our full potential and be the best that we can be.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Susan. Well, every Saturday at 7 o'clock, we meet for a mastermind group, and Alan is always there faithfully, apart from when you forget to put your alarm clock on.
Or I fall asleep or something.
That's right. Yeah. So those of you who want to join us for those masterminds at 7 o'clock every Saturday, I'll send you the Zoom link. So feel free, because it's conversations like these that lead to these random unknown insights that we hadn't kind of planned. They emerge out of nowhere seemingly. And we've had some fascinating conversations over the years.
Yes, and we do solve world problems occasionally.
Sorry, Alan,
I said we solve world problems occasionally.
We chip away at them.
Yes.
It's more accurate to say we chip away at the world problems, yes. Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I'll speak with you all soon. Hopefully.
Thank you very much for having us.
Bye-bye to all of you.
Bye.
Okay, then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye-bye.